I've got an initialized patch here, and I want to look at the LFO section in more detail. Now, by default, an initialized patch starts with these two routings. So let's look at them a bit more closely because it involves a default use of an LFO, and it's what's called a secondary routing. Now, we have LFO1 controlling pitch fine, and we have the modulation wheel controlling the LFO1 depth. So that's what we call secondary modulation. So when I move the pitch wheel, it's controlling the depth of the LFO, which is then controlling the pitch fine parameter. And as I move my wheel, you'll see the momentary dot move. And if we look on the front panel, we'll see that the fine pitch control, which is over here, is set to the default center position, and the depth is at the minimum for LFO1, so that when I move the mod wheel, it'll modulate the depth and send some to modulate the fine pitch control. So that's a default starting point for how LFO1 is usually used to generate a subtle vibrato like that. Let's put the filter on. It's a pretty harsh sound. Let's start with that. Now let's assign a new routing, and I'm going to assign LFO2 to control amplitude, the volume. And let's look at the LFO section. Now we have a variety of different shapes. As we know, this is a cyclical pattern that repeats over and over again and affects the target parameter. In this case, it'll be volume. And we use these stepper buttons to go through the different cyclical patterns, and I'll go through them in a moment. But let's look at the other controls first of all. Now, the rate, the speed at which it goes through the pattern, can be expressed in terms of cycles per second. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, so generally it oscillates at a very low number of cycles per second. Or we can turn the sync button on and have it go through the pattern in musical subdivisions. Let's start with quarter notes for now. We have the depth. I'm going to put this all the way up. How much of this pattern is being fed into the modulation section to modulate the target parameter? We have a delay button, which will basically offset when the pattern starts. I'm going to leave it off for now. And we have a plus button here, which changes the direction from unipolar to bipolar. Let me center this, and you'll see the white dot is moving both sides, back and forth on both sides. If I hit the plus button, it moves in just one direction. It's what we call unipolar. And here we have a phase offset slider, so we can control where in the actual waveform we want the LFO pattern to start from. And finally, we have some trigger modes. We've seen these before in other sections of Trillion. We have a note trigger mode where the pattern will get triggered each new note on. Legato mode, when multiple notes are played, it only triggers on the beginning of the first note. Or if you're playing very staccato notes, it'll trigger each new note in that case as well. Or song position, where it follows the host sequencer. Or free, where it just runs freely independent of the notes that are happening. I'm going to leave it in note mode now. And let's listen to what I have programmed up here. I'll have a little pattern with a long sustained bass sound. I'm going to mute this for now. Let's listen to it as is with just a sustained sound. So let's start by modulating the amplitude with this shape. I'm going to turn up the amount here. And I can invert it. So you hear now it's pulsing on the offbeats because it's inverted. So this is basically a sine waveform. It's a smooth shape, and it begins with a positive value and then curves to negative and then back again. And so this is good for sweeps and vibratos and this type of thing. Let's look at the next pattern that we have. Now this is a triangle wave. It's positive, negative shape as well, like the sine wave, but without the curves, so it's a little bit of a sharper kind of attack. Let's put it into unipolar mode. And I can offset the start of it. Let's try that. I'll offset it more. So you hear it waited a while until the pattern started. Let's put that back down. Now the next pattern we have is a square wave, and this starts at maximum value and then drops to minimum value. And this is good for trills and pulsing effects. So it's good for this type of thing. We'll get a more of a sharper note on off. So we hear a nice sharp clean attack. And again, I can offset the start point. Let me unsolo it, and we heard it starting with distinctive quarter notes. If I put this in the middle, I'll use shift for fine increments, and there it is at 500. We should hear it pulsing in the exact opposite on eighth notes now. And if I invert it, we'll be back to quarter notes. So you see how these controls work. Let's put this back over here. And I'm leaving it in note mode so we can really hear the effects of these patterns for now. Kind of hard to grab hold. There we go. All right, so let's look at the next pattern. Here we have a rounded square. It's just a smoother kind of shape. And we can change the rate. If I want to have, let's say, 16th notes, I can get more of a pulsing sound. And we can modulate pan or other parameters as well. So all kinds of interesting effects. Let's go back to amplitude, and we'll look at the next one. I'm going to use the stepper button, and there we have a kind of ramp. It's also called a sawtooth wave, and that goes dramatically from the highest point to the lowest point. Let me put it to pan because with amplitude it's a little bit harder to hear. And then we have a reverse ramp, which is the opposite direction. I'll center that. And if I invert it, we'll get the effect of the original ramp. And the next one we have is a sample and hold pattern. This is interesting. It's kind of a stepped random value. So it's random values, but not smoothly like a sine wave, but more like a square wave where it's stepped. And this is really nice for filter. Let's put this to filter cutoff. And I'll put this down low. And I'll put it to 16ths. We'll get a nice random stepped cutoff. So that works very nicely. Next shape we have is a nice unique trillion one called heartbeat, and it basically models itself after the human heartbeat. It's a spike and then several shorter or less dramatic spikes after that. And finally, the last one we have is a random pattern. And this is similar to the sample and hold one, but this has random values and it doesn't step through them. The value changes immediately. This is good for real random effects. Let's try this one on pan. Should give us some wild oscillation from side to side. That's good for generating random pan values. So that's an overview of the LFO section. We also have some presets that we can use from the drop-down menu here, and they just call up different types of settings here. But it basically goes through all the parameters that we've looked at manually. So preset menus, 6 available LFOs, various shapes. We can sync it to tempo. We can offset the start point of the cycle. We can control the rate either in musical values when sync is on or in cycles per second. We can attenuate or boost the depth here that's sent to the modulation section. And we can alternate between unipolar and bipolar modes and use the phase offset to start the pattern from the middle of the cycle or anywhere in the cycle rather than just the beginning. See you for more in the next video.